you can actually get a digital copy of your voter ID card.
This is the one federal law that applies to all states and territories. It's called UOCAVA.
I'm Scott Jarrett. I forgot.
You forgot who he was.
I almost said I was Ray. Hello, and welcome to episode 6 of our monthly video series, Election Connection. I'm Scott Jarrett.
And I'm Ray Valenzuela. We are your elections directors from Maricopa County. Each month, we have a new episode of Election Connection,
where we, your elections directors, answers questions from you, the viewers.
And today, Scott, the first question is for you. So the question is, what forms of ID can I show at the polls in order to vote?
And that is a very good question, especially since the state of Arizona is one of the few states that requires voters to provide ID when they're getting a regular ballot at the voting location. In Arizona, we require a voter to provide ID at whether they're voting in person early, during in-person at emergency voting, or on election day. And the state of Arizona requires 3 separate lists, or establishes 3 separate lists of ID that a voter would need to get a standard ballot. The first list is, and which the vast majority of voters will use, is a list that's a government issued ID that has an address that matches the site book check-in station, or the poll, the roster, the sign-in roster. In Maricopa County, we have our site books. So the vast majority of voters, that will be their driver's license. But it could be a non-operator ID, it could be a federal government ID, or it could be a tribal ID, as long as it has a photo and that address that matches the signature roster. The second list of ID is common, it could be a utility bill that was issued within the last 90 days. It could also be a voter registration card. In Maricopa County, if you go to beballotready.vote, you can actually get a digital copy of your voter ID card right on your smartphone. It could also be a copy of your insurance bill, so from your car, as long as that address matches the roster or the site book check-in station. And the last form of ID, or list number 3, would be a government issued ID but does not have an address. So it could be an Arizona driver's license, but it doesn't match your current address. And what you would need is a list 2 item. So again, a utility bill that was issued within that last 90 days, a copy of your voter registration ID card, or it could be like your insurance statement. But it also could be a military ID or a passport. Neither of those typically have your address. And one other common question is, will my student ID work? And actually it won't work because it is a government issued ID. It does not have an address on there. So you would need a form of your driver's license or one of those other items from either list 1, list 2, or list 3. You can go to maricopa.vote and find a full list of all the different IDs that would be acceptable under our ID at the polls section. Okay, Ray, so the next question is for you.
Actually, Scott, before we move on, it just reminded me, since early voting is under my purview, that just to let voters know that if you go vote early in person, that you still also have to provide ID. So you're voting by mail, we use your signature as proof of identity, but I just wanted to point that out too, because it is, a lot of people think, well, I go early, you still need to, by state law, provide ID for in-person early.
That's correct. Thanks, Ray. All right, so this next question is, can I live abroad and still vote in Maricopa County?
Well, again, another great question from our viewers, and the answer is yes. There is some requirements with regards to that. There is a point by which, if you want a one-time request sent to your house in France, you could do that and have that ballot because you're coming back. But how
do you know that I live in France in my own time?
Because I see pictures of your villa all the time, and I'm so jealous of it. But for what I think the intended question was, if you're abroad, there's folks that live indefinitely, literally in a villa in France. They're expatriates, if you will. They're still entitled to vote for federal offices. Or you may be temporarily away, or you may be military deployed somewhere, or military in state at Fort Hood in Texas, Fort Huachuca in south of Tucson. So there is a actual method that's designed by the federal government. The irony is that states have their own rules, as Scott mentioned, about ID at the polls. Not every state has it. This is the one federal law that applies to all states and territories. It is a federal act that was passed actually almost 36 years to the date. August 1986 is when it was passed. So we're celebrating the anniversary of it. It's called UOCAVA. What does that stand for? Uniform and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act. So we in the field usually refer internally to a UOCAVA voter, which is basically an overseas citizen who is temporarily away or indefinitely away, and or a military uniformed services, more proper, individual who's stationed along with their family that may be deployed with them. So it is a federal law that applies to elections, voting rights for those U.S. citizens that fit that particular category. So the act requires that all U.S. states and territories that they allow those individuals covered under this particular circumstance, again, overseas citizen or military who is overseas, Afghanistan, or in-state. But if you're in-state, you cannot qualify for this as a regular voter. You have to be uniformed service. But for those individuals, they are covered and they get special treatment, which anytime we do some sort of tour, I always say, if anybody deserves a right to vote, it's our men and women of the military that protect that democracy. But those individuals, in addition to overseas citizens like Scott in his villa in France during his summer breaks that he goes, but those overseas citizens, temporary away, it allows them to, one, register to vote if they're not already registered. It allows them to do that up to election day, 7 p.m. on election day. Again, a little bit of logistics in there, but because of the nature of your distance, you're in Afghanistan, you have to get some special status treatment. So that's one of the main things is it allows for them to do, but it also allows for them to get it at this time and is referred to as an absentee ballot in federal law, but for us, it's an early ballot. But what's very specific for them is, again, they get the right to register up until 7 p.m., but they also get to get their ballots at 45 days prior. So when if you're listening to any of our other Election Connections series, early voting starts 27 days, always 27 days prior. For military, uniformed services, overseas citizen voters, that's 45 days. Why? That special coverage says you may be in Afghanistan, and if we put it in the mail, you would not get it in time if we mailed in 27. So there's a special exception to mail those earlier. I like to point that out because a lot of people think election day is, example, November 8th. It's not. It's 45 days before that we have to have ballots built. We have to have everything ready. Who's covered and who's allowed? Or let me actually go back to one more time as to what other special exception they get. They get to choose how they want that ballot delivered to them. So they can opt to be by mail at 45 days, by fax, some people still have fax machines, or sent to them electronically. What does that mean? That means that we actually can distribute almost instantly, and we have a lot of our UOCAVA voters. I think we're almost close to 6,000 Maricopa voters, residents that are abroad or in uniformed services that opt to get their ballot delivered to them. And most of them are doing it electronically because it's instant. At E- 45 days prior, they're getting that ballot electronically. It also allows a UOCAVA covered voter to return their ballot by mail, by fax, or electronically. We have a secure portal. We and the state both have a secure portal that the voter can cast their ballot, still need to sign their affidavit, take an image or scan that in and upload that to us so they can not only instantly receive the ballot, but almost instantly return it to make sure they meet that 7 p.m. election day deadline for getting us that ballot back. So who's covered? There used to be 7 uniformed services covered. Now it's 8, and you'll know which is the 8 when I read them out. But it's basically the Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, Public Health Services Commission Corps. Scott is former Coast Guard, so go Coast Guard. And then number 7 was a National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Commissioned Officer Corps. The 8th, which everybody knows is newly added, the United States Space Force. So those 8 uniformed services are covered members and their family. Members of the Merchant Marine. Let me back up again. Family members that are deployed with these individuals. So if you're deployed with your husband, your spouse, your children, you are eligible. If your husband or wife is deployed and you're local, then you would not qualify for the 45-day, you would vote in town. But it is members of the Merchant Marine or their family members of the uniformed services. Again, also U.S. citizens that are not uniformed services, and you have an option when you fill out this form, and we'll talk about that form before I close. You indicate am I temporarily away? Are you on a mission? Are you a Doctors Without Borders? Or are you just on an extended vacation? Once again, jealous of that, but you could be overseas for a month, and then you qualify for that. So you can vote a regular ballot if you're temporarily away, overseas citizen, but there is a category if you're a citizen residing outside the United States indefinitely with no known intent to return. You still retain your citizenship, you still retain the ability to vote, and you can vote for federal offices such as president. So again, there is categories out there. And back to what I was talking about, the form, how do I request if I'm a uniformed service or overseas citizen or overseas voter? You must submit what is called a federal postcard application, FPCA for short. And on that, you define that I am a uniformed citizen, I'm active duty, or I'm an eligible spouse or dependent. Or you define and select that I'm an overseas citizen living outside the country with an intent to return. What does that matter? So you can get a full ballot for all of those offices and districts that are applicable to you when you return. Or you identify you're an overseas citizen without intent to return, or return is uncertain. Then we would be able to give you a federal only ballot that would still allow you to participate for those offices. So again, the form itself is a federal postcard application. You'd provide us just like a registration form, because it does serve as one if you're not already registered. You provide us the basic information: name, your local address or last known address here in Maricopa County, date of birth, proof of citizenship. All of that still is applicable. The only difference is you add that status. Are you overseas citizen, overseas temporarily, or uniformed service? And you give us the method of how you want that ballot delivered. I want it by mail, I want it by fax, or I want it electronically. So those allow us to service those folks that are abroad or in uniformed service. And it is, again, that federal postcard application is both a registration form and a request for a ballot. So it's a dual form, and it serves its purpose to allow us to serve those voters that are abroad. The last thing I'll point out is that if you are in that category, we do have a page dedicated. So if you go to maricopa.vote, it'll take you to our main elections page. But on our main election page, there's a voting tab. And if you hover over that, you'll see all these different options. And on there to the right, I know exactly where it was. I was visiting earlier. There's a category that says military and overseas voters, and it lists links such as what is UOCAVA, exactly what I kind of said here. Military, the actual ballot request, you can do that federal postcard application online through our site. And even one more added bonus, it has a UOCAVA map. I really, a shout out to our GIS department. It literally, if you hover over there, it's an interactive map that shows you how many voters, as an example, are in Germany that are military and how many are civilian. And one thing I don't forget, Canada and Mexico are considered overseas. So if you're permanently residing or temporary in Canada or Mexico, that is, even though they're not divided by water, they're out of country, so it's classified as overseas. So that's the big pool. And the only thing to restate is to remember that E45 is a deadline date, and it is Saturday, September 12th, that we will begin mailing for this November 8th election. And if anybody's qualified, make sure to go visit that site and I'm going to push here to recommend you do electronic delivery, because that just ensures to us peace of mind for us and for you that you'll get that ballot almost instant.
Well, Ray, just a fun fact. I don't think I've ever told you this before, but the first time I ever voted actually was using the UOCAVA ballot. So it was when I was in the Coast Guard, and I was stationed in Miami, Florida, in the Coast Guard, and I received my ballot, and it was actually for the 2020 our 2000 presidential election. So I was able to take advantage of the UOCAVA system and be able to cast my ballot here, an Arizona ballot, while I was living in Florida. So it is a great system.
Well, if you were in Maricopa when that happened, then I probably handled your ballot, since I'm as I like to say, the dinosaur of elections here 30 years. So I think I do remember your signature, and it looked a lot like mine, but we'll talk about that later.
All right. Well, thank you, Ray, and thank our viewers for tuning in. And don't forget, you can submit your questions to us so we can answer them in our next episode at justthefacts.vote, and you can also sign up for our monthly newsletter. Thank you.
Thank you all.